Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here to give the summary of my longer 4-hour lecture in response to Gavin Ortlund on the issue of icon veneration. And so, as everybody starts trickling in, I do want to make clear that sometimes people can get excited when you publish a 4-hour video because they think, wow, there's so much evidence for my side. That's great. And if you don't actually watch the video, though, or if you don't actually understand the argument, then personally, I would desire that you understand an argument than the spectacle around it, right? And the reason why I made that 4-hour video was not for the spectacle, not to just kind of make everybody feel good, like, look, wow, 4 hours of evidence. The reason why I did that video was I put a lot of effort, a lot of time and energy into the research for that. And there was just a lot to say because this topic really does have a lot of intricacies and unique details. In my original lecture, I talked about how, going to Nicaea 2, looking at it in its context, and then trying to take it into the context of Protestant and Catholic debates today. It's like translating the Bible from its original Greek into Latin and then into English rather than going straight from the Greek to the English, right? You have to do all these different maneuvers in order to avoid anachronism, to be careful, to be precise. And so in today's lecture, what I'm going to do is give you the short version of the 4-hour presentation. And I'll mention a few new things. These aren't new arguments, but just kind of clarifying some points or emphasizing points that I didn't do so before. But I'm hoping that today will be helpful. And I really do encourage you in the comments section in the live stream to really ask your questions. So I want to cover them at the end, because if you have any questions, if you don't understand the argument, then I'm really here to help you understand the argument, to ask maybe difficult questions. Because once again, the whole point of what I'm doing is not for the spectacle of, oh, Swan did a 4-hour video, right? That doesn't mean anything to me if you don't understand the argument, right? Because that's why I'm doing this, because I do think there is something substantive to be said. And with that being said, then, I do want to begin on a humorous note with my presentation. So a while back, Gavin published his video, Watching Every Icon's Response Video. And I made my own kind of humorous thumbnail. And I decided, since passions might be hot right now, that it would be good to begin with a kind of funny image that I made of a counter thumbnail. So as you can see on the far right there, Jim Halpert, Asian Jim there, and I put that as myself. So, just something fun, because in this discourse, I think it's really easy for people to make personal attacks, to be upset, especially because this is a very, I realize, a sensitive topic, because it hits on a lot of things that are at the center of Catholic cultic liturgical life, like the veneration of saints and the veneration of icons. And so I do want to make sure that as we go forward in this discussion, we are respectful to everybody. We don't insult Gavin. And also, I did notice people told me that Gavin was concerned about maybe how I had depicted his presentation of the Church Fathers. And so I will address all of those in due course. But I did want to begin with this kind of funny image. The outline for today's presentation is the following. What I'm going to do is give an introduction where I review once again Gavin's objections, my responses, and my thesis. Then I'll give a summary of my kind of overall argument. Then we'll look at the two objections that I wanted to look at in the previous presentation, some comments for going forward on how to deal with this debate, and then once again looking at the conclusion. I noticed that some people were actually kind of confused on what I'm arguing, which surprised me a little bit, because I do have slides in the original presentation that literally lay out my responses and my thesis. But I thought, okay, maybe, there's a lot of information there. And so to be charitable, here's the video where I'm breaking it all down. So Gavin's objections, as I recall them, were threefold. The first was that there's no development allowed by Nicaea 2, right? Gavin argues that Nicaea 2 does not allow for any developments from the apostles to the council. Nicaea 2 is basically saying that the apostles venerated icons like the 8th century iconophiles or iconoduals. And then my commentary here is that, this is problematic because it seems like development is the only plausible route for a Catholic. The second objection that Gavin raised concerned the fathers. He argued that the Church Fathers would not have recognized Nicaea 2 as a valid development, meaning that even a developmental reading here is implausible. And somebody pointed out that another important facet of Gavin's argument here is that it is meant to be an internal critique. In my first lecture on icons and doctrinal development, I mentioned that. In the 4-hour lecture, I don't think I did. And so I do want to rectify that and say that, yeah, Gavin is intending this to be some type of internal critique. But even if that's the case, I do deal with that in the presentation, the longer one, and I can talk about that here. But there are some kind of ambiguities here with the argument, because whenever somebody just lists out, a bunch of the fathers, one of my questions is, okay, what's the point here? Is it that Nicaea II's theology would have been totally alien? Is it actually saying that each of the fathers contradict Nicaea II, that it was unheard of? So is it an argument from contradiction, an argument from silence, a universal consensus against Nicaea II? The argument can shift in all kinds of different directions. And so I will talk about that in objection 2. The third objection, which I don't address in the 4-hour lecture, is the anathemas, because I've noticed that Gavin and other Protestants have a moral objection to the anathemas of Nicaea II, and maybe the system of anathemas in general. Gavin argues that it is wrong to anathematize fellow Christians on poor evidence on non-salvation issues especially. My response is threefold. So regarding objection 1, no development, I argue that not only is Nicaea II compatible with development, but the development interpretation is better than Gavin's interpretation of the council. So I'm not just saying that it's compatible with development, but Nicaea II actually implies, or in some sense is better suited with the development interpretation than Gavin's interpretation of the council. And I point out here that Nicaea II leaves open the precise manner of apostolic icon veneration. The second objection concerns the fathers. And I say here that I'll offer a plausible developmental history of icon veneration from the apostles to the council, engaging along the way Gavin's use of the sources. And then the third objection concerned the anathemas, and I just said in response that I believe the anathemas of Nicaea II were issued on reasonable theological and evidential grounds. But that's not the focus of the presentation today or the presentation that I previously gave. The anathemas are something that I'd like to cover maybe in a future episode and tackle that another time. But I'm really hitting these first two because when I was preparing the previous lecture, I just kind of felt like the third objection didn't fit, because the first two objections were kind of related to development, and then the third one was a kind of moral argument in a different category. And so I thought, given that the presentation was already 140 something slides, it's best to just kind of keep it to those first two. So let me see if there's anything else that I want to say about this slide. If not, then I think I'll continue. Okay. So I also gave in the original presentation my thesis, which is that there is a plausible case to be made of development from the apostles to Nicaea II on the matter of image veneration, and I gave 2 subpoints. The first is that Nicaea II not only allows for, but implies development from the apostles to the council. The second thing I then said was that there is a plausible development in image veneration from the apostles to the council. And, the thesis slide almost sounds just basically like the response slide. I think I just tried to do this to make this even more clear, but I wonder if that might have caused some confusion. But, once again, this is what I'm arguing. And I do want to make clear on the spot, I am arguing that there has been image veneration and a cultic use of images from the very beginning of Christianity. I am not denying that point. Once again, let me make it clear. I am arguing that there has been image veneration and a cultic use of images from the very beginning of Christianity. Let's continue. So now going into the summary of my argument, I do want to show kind of how all the pieces come together. Because if you're wondering, okay, Swan, what was exactly your argument? Here's the kind of whole chart that depicts it. And so my argument is that, look, images were always used in the Christian cult, especially for saint veneration. Hence, they always had a cultic use. What changed over time were the specific cultic uses of images in the cult of saints. And so I do depict here in the chart that when I begin, for example, with evidence from the Old Testament of people bowing and praying to the temple, of the ark being, an object of veneration of some sort, although it's really directed more towards God, who is on the mercy seat on the ark. Or I give examples of, for example, King David. When the Israelites bow down to God, they also bow down to King David in the same motion, in the same act. Or even in Psalm 45, when the king himself is called God. These examples of showing that in the history of ancient Israel, there was a shifting boundary on the nature of images. Before, images were very restricted because the Israelites were in the desert, they were nomadic. And what would basically happen is God would tell Moses, okay, here's what you're going to build, and I'm going to give you the exact designs. But then as time went on, eventually when you get into the established Davidic monarchy, David can now design the temple himself, although God commissions it. And then Solomon, builds the temple. And then when you look at the administration of King Hezekiah, you see that Hezekiah had a seal with images on it. And even Eliakim, the chief steward under King Hezekiah, also has seals or images on his seal. And the point is that eventually, as the monarchy is established, the boundary around images changes. Before it was very restricted. Now it's widening because the kingdom has been secured, because the king is sitting on the throne. And so you do have this idea then of, venerating artifacts and persons close to God. One example being the king, who is almost like the, human symbol of God on the earth. And eventually the temple of God and the palace of the king, those become intertwined. The cult of God, the cult of the king come together, the royal cult. And then as time goes on, when we get into Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, I presented evidence of the intercession and veneration of saints in Second Temple Judaism, leading up to the time of Jesus and even around the time of Jesus in sources like Josephus. And what I show is that, the practice of venerating saints through images on their tombs, of fine monuments and craftsmanship, that was there. And so art was always in the cult of saints, even in Second Temple Judaism, even during the time of the apostles and Jesus. And so there was always a cultic use of art in the veneration of saints. Now, to then get to the veneration of saints, to image veneration, you need the veneration principle. The veneration principle being that the honor given to the type passes to the prototype. The honor or dishonor given to an image goes to the one who is depicted in that image. And once you have the veneration principle connecting the veneration of saints and the veneration of images, right? That's the glue that connects the two of them together. As developments occur in the veneration of saints, you can also then use that veneration principle to justify different ways of venerating the saint through the image, right? So maybe an earlier Christian generation would venerate the saint by, using that image to just remember them, right? To have them around their shops, to in some way have that saint intercede for them, and they can use that image as a way to call them to mind. And then eventually it can build up then to kissing and bowing, because if the idea is that the saints are living, and in Exodus 18:7, when Moses went to go meet his father-in-law, he bowed and kissed him, right? If this is a biblical way of greeting and showing love and affection for a family member, for someone who is living and the saints are living and they are our family members, then we can do this. And so that kind of covers almost the basic premise of the presentation. I do want to emphasize that the doctrine that undergirds the cult of image veneration is the veneration of saints. And from that doctrine with the veneration principle, you not only get then the ability to venerate saints through images, but then you can also justify changes over time in the ways in which you do that. Because, for example, you can start treating images in some sense like living persons, in the sense that you are transferring, a bow or a kiss to the one that is represented in the image. That becomes permissible if the veneration principle holds. And so that's kind of the basic gist of the argument there. To use an analogy that I used in the presentation, take the practice in the Latin West of Eucharistic adoration, where we bow, pray, even kiss, in some cases, the Blessed Sacrament in the monstrance. The underlying doctrine there is transubstantiation, is the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. And then from there, we take that doctrine of transubstantiation and then put it in a cultic setting, in a setting of communal practice, of a way of cultivating devotion to Christ. And what happens then is that we can use, that doctrine to justify a cultic practice. And for example, somebody might complain, well, but Swan, this practice in the Latin West is not shared in the East of adoring the Eucharist. And it's like, well, in some sense, yes, not quite in the same way. But the basic underlying principle was that the Eucharist was adored, it was loved, it was held to be Jesus Christ himself. And so you could say that what justifies this development of the practice of, putting the Eucharist in a monstrance and adoring it, in a private, chapel or grotto, is that underlying doctrine of transubstantiation and then eventually moving on into the cult and how that is applied. And so the bottom line here is, once again, the underlying doctrine is the veneration of saints, and then that veneration principle does get the ball moving. There are other things that I do want to talk about, like where does the incarnation fit into all of this? Where do relics fit into all of this? But that is the basic argument there. I also want to mention some passages of scripture that Nicaea II used, and the numbers there, 528, 162, are the pages in Father Price's translation of the Acts of Nicaea II. So, for example, Hebrews 1:3 was cited, where it says, "And he, Jesus, is the radiance of his or God's glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power." I'd mentioned this in passing, and I think I did in the presentation, but I want to bring this to the forefront, that when Athanasius and Basil the Great use, the argument that if you have an emperor and you have an image of the emperor, whatever you do to that image in some way passes to that emperor, or it communicates what you believe about that emperor. And this was used in the context by Basil and Athanasius to defend how worshiping God the Son does not detract from worshiping God the Father. Because just as in the case of the image of the emperor, it's not two separate emperors, it's one emperor, but then you have this image there, which is the exact representation of that emperor's form or nature. And so that the honor given to the emperor's image goes to the emperor. Similarly, the honor given to God the Son, who is the exact representation of God the Father, that honor given to God the Son goes to God the Father. And it's not two gods, it's one God. Just as it's not two emperors, it's one emperor. And so I actually do think that Hebrews 1:3 gives us maybe some evidence of an apostolic validation, a scriptural validation of that veneration argument that Basil and Athanasius use. Somebody might complain, but Swan, that was used in the case of the Trinity. That's not doing the work that you needed to do for the debate on Nicaea II. But one of the things to point out, and even Pope Hadrian, this is kind of how Hadrian exegeted some of the text. What's the presupposition? What has to be true in order for the argument to hold? What has to be true is that the veneration principle can be applied to images, such that if that holds, then the analogy in some sense to the Trinity can hold as well. So the presupposition here is that they do think that something about the image does capture the exact representation of the person's form, such that the honor given to the image can pass to the person. That's important. So what's the presupposition undergirding that particular use of the argument? But Nicaea II does also nuance the veneration principle, because they do want to say that, obviously the way in which an image has the form of a person isn't exactly the same way in which God the Son is in the form of God the Father, right? Obviously there's a difference there, because we wouldn't say an image is consubstantial with the person, right? That would be getting into kind of, the pagan territory that Arnobius was objecting to. Rather, we're using that analogy, but we're acknowledging that it's not univocal, right? But it is useful for the debate. Similarly, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, this was cited by the council left and right. They mention this following passage where it says, "By faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff." Now, some of the council fathers do kind of add in that he kissed the top of the staff, but I don't know where they got that from. They might have been reading that into the text. But the point I want to make here is that when you look at, for example, the Hebrew of Genesis 47:31, which is the reference in the book of Hebrews, it says, "And he said, 'Swear to me.' So he swore to him. Then Israel," or Jacob, "bowed in worship at or towards the head of the bed." All right, that's interesting. Whereas in the Septuagint, it takes the bed and turns it into a staff. And then the book of Hebrews sides with the Septuagint over what you can say is the Hebrew, the Masoretic text. So that's just something interesting to point out. Now, I don't know to what extent this will be successful as an argument for the veneration of an image or the veneration of a staff or something like that. But what Nicaea II did say was that by honoring that staff, it was meant to also honor Joseph and the sons of Joseph. But it's interesting because if the Hebrew holds, then, it's worshiping God and it's going towards the head of the bed. That's interesting. And then, using an object somehow in that process. But I think what I do think is really strong is the Hebrews 1:3 point. I think there you can really get Basil and Athanasius' argument. All right, so let's go now to objection 1, the no development objection. So, as I said before, I'm going to argue that Nicaea 2 is compatible with development, and that the development interpretation is better than Gaben's interpretation of the council. So, notice it's not just one thing, it's two things: compatibility and you can say what is implied by the council itself. Nicaea 2 leaves open the precise manner of apostolic icon veneration. To put the debate in context, what we are debating, Gaben and I, is the contested passage, which is at the near like the end of the seventh session, which is the last session of the council. And this is what is said. The Holy Council exclaimed, "We all believe accordingly. We all hold the same. We have all signed in accord. This is the faith of the apostles. This is the faith of the fathers. This is the faith of the Orthodox. This is the faith that has sustained the world. Believing in one God, to be praised in Trinity, we kiss the honorable images. May those who do not hold accordingly be anathema. May those who do not believe accordingly be driven far away from the church. We follow the ancient legislation of the Catholic Church. We observe the decrees of the fathers. We anathematize those who either add anything or remove anything from the church. We anathematize the intrusive innovation of the accusers of Christians." So this is the passage that we really need to wrestle with, because if it is true that this passage is saying there's no development at all allowed from the apostles to the council, all right, then Gaben's interpretation is correct. If, however, there are grounds for believing that it's not that narrow and that you need to read everything in context, well, I would say that when you read everything in context, it's not nearly that narrow. And so the question then that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we interpret the contested passage? Because one thing we could do is simply reread it and just say, look, this is what it's saying. This is the faith of the apostles. This is the faith of the fathers. But I mean, the contested passage is precisely the thing that we are debating. And what I would like to do is look elsewhere into the text of the council to see what clues can help us understand what it's talking about. For example, when it says, this is the faith of the fathers, this is the faith of the apostles, what is that this referring to exactly? And then also, when it says believing in one God, to be praised in Trinity, we kiss the honorable images. We can say that as apostolic, but in what sense is it apostolic? Is it apostolic because the apostles literally made that exact same argument? Or is it apostolic because the conclusion somehow of kissing the honorable images follows from the apostolic doctrine of believing in one God to be praised in Trinity, right? There are different nuances here on what apostolic could mean. And so what I did in my presentation is I looked at what is the this of this is the faith of the apostles, this is the faith of the fathers. And when you look at earlier in the seventh session, it lays out the decision very clearly on what the this is. We therefore decree with all care and precision that venerable and holy images made in colors or mosaic or other fitting materials in the same way as the figure of the honorable and life-giving cross are to be dedicated in the holy churches of God, on sacred vessels and vestments, on walls and panels, in houses and in the streets, namely the image of our Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ, of our Immaculate Lady, the Holy Theotokos, and of the honorable angels and all the holy and sacred men. So there are three parts to the decree. The first is that there are images that are venerable and holy. They can fall into this category, right? Not all images are profane, and images can be venerable. They can, merit veneration in some sense. The second thing is that they can be dedicated in various places, not just churches, but even in private practice. So even in a wider cultic setting, these can be applied, not just in the church, not just in certain religious spaces, but even in the house, even on the streets, right? These are allowed. And then finally, it's saying that the images can be of persons, particularly, God the Word incarnate and Our Lady and the honorable angels and saints and so on and so forth. So those are the three parts of the decree. In this sense, then, Nicaea 2 is saying this is the apostolic faith. This is the faith of the fathers. That you have venerable and holy images that can be placed in churches and elsewhere of the saints and of holy men and women and the angels. So in what sense still is this apostolic? In what sense is this the faith of the apostles? Is it maybe something like the substance of the theology? To what extent is this a historical claim on what the apostles had done? We need to look further. But this is getting us started right in the right direction. And so let me now lay out what my responses were, what my arguments were for this section. So the first reason why I argue that Nicaea 2 is compatible with development, and this is important, is one, the decree and sessions of the council leave open the precise manner of apostolic icon veneration, even when it presents evidence or makes claims in the time of the apostles. So it'll say things like, for example, the council says over and over again in different places that the creation, the making, the reproduction of art, that is from the time of the apostles. It says that over and over and over again. But then when it actually tries to talk about how the apostles venerated icons, nothing is said. Nothing directly or expressly is said on how the apostles had venerated icons, anything of that sort. And so this is surprising them because, they'll talk about, for example, how the hemorrhaging woman in the Gospels, how she had built a statue in honor of Christ. But when it comes to, the apostles, it's a bit more open-ended on what exactly they did. The second thing is that Nicaea 2 does not defend bowing and kissing to images by expressly claiming that the apostles also bowed and kissed to images, right? I mean, if you could find somewhere in Nicaea 2 where it says that the apostles bowed and kissed to images, then I think that would settle the debate, right? And then you would have to say, okay, there's no development allowed. Somebody might say, but Swan, this is a really kind of high standard because it doesn't have to be expressly said. I mean, it's contained in the text itself. This is the faith of the fathers. This is the faith of the apostles. And my answer in response to that is, but I mean, that's precisely the contested text. And I'm saying that given other evidences in the surrounding writings of the council, that shapes how we can interpret those passages such that we don't have to do the kind of reading in that one is doing there by saying, oh, when it says this is the faith of the apostles, it's saying that the apostles themselves were kissing and bowing to images. I mean, to use an example, it would be like if a Catholic and a Protestant were debating John 6 or, the Last Supper narratives, and they were trying to figure out what is the doctrine of the real presence. And a Catholic just kept on saying, look, it says, this is my body. This is my body. Right? That's it. But then a Protestant could say, well, I mean, that's precisely the thing that we're contesting, right? And so you can't just kind of foot stomp and say that settles the debate. You need to look at the surrounding context. And so I would actually agree that you can't just foot stomp and just read the same passage over and over again. You need to go look into other context clues to help you interpret that contested passage. And when we look into the context clues to interpret that contested passage, we really don't see what we would expect. And I remember, the arguments of this section were established in a modus tollens fashion. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. And I know that in the lecture, I actually had messed that up because I got too excited and I wasn't thinking clearly. I said, if A, therefore B, not B, therefore A. And I was like, that's so embarrassing. So, just to call myself out there. But it was funny because the arguments were themselves properly logically formatted. But when I was articulating that, my mind was all over the place. I said it wrong. So there's that. But to get back to the point, I'm saying that, there's a lot of instances where we would expect, there are things that we would expect if Gavin's interpretation were true, but we precisely don't see those things. And it's interesting that, if they were arguing, right, that the apostles were bowing and kissing to images and that's why they do it now, why don't they just say that clearly, explicitly? Or, for example, to look at the third point, the reasoning of Nicaea 2, the four principal arguments, which I mentioned in the PowerPoint slides on the 7th session, they're primarily theological arguments. They aren't just historical one-for-one correspondence kind of arguments where, oh, the apostles bowed and kissed images, therefore we bow and kiss images as well. It's not that simple. So, the arguments that Nicaea 2 gave in the final session, the kind of summative arguments that they considered to be the weightiest that caused them to come to their conclusion. First, it was the incarnation. Second, it was the fact that there is sacred art. There is that category, art that is sanctifying, art that is profitable. The idea of the indefectible identity of the church, that one, the church is indefectible, and the church has now said image veneration is okay, and so it can't be wrong. But also because images are so much part of the Christian identity, to reject that cult of images is to some way reject the church itself. And then finally, the veneration principle, the honor given to the type passes to the prototype, that also is rearticulated here. So what are these arguments doing theologically? Well, the incarnation is mentioned in Nicaea too, because one, the incarnation shows that you can actually be nourished, spiritually nourished, truly nourished by a visible thing, the body of Christ, right? The incarnate Lord. God made himself visible. And so that has consequences then, where you can't just sweepingly say anymore that the visible world is bad, because then what happens to the humanity of Jesus? The second thing, too, is a cultic angle on the incarnation. Because the idea is that if in our liturgy, we have to constantly deal with the heresies of people saying that the body of Christ isn't really a corporeal human body, but it's kind of a phantasmal thing. It's not real because God's actually immaterial and invisible. And so the incarnation is just kind of a phantasm. We don't have to take the visibility of the humanity of God, the Word, that seriously. If in our liturgy, we can't have images of Christ, so Christ becomes invisible in our liturgy, that kind of sends the wrong message then. We would want to reaffirm the incarnation by seeing, depictions of his body, seeing depictions of, the cross and the crucifixion to remind us that no, he really did suffer. He really is our high priest who can relate to us. And so that's the role of the incarnation in the theology of Nicaea too. When it comes to sacred art, what they wanted to point out was simply that the church fathers really did recognize that art can have a valid role in the cult, in spiritually nourishing Christians, in improving our faith and helping us really honor Christ and honor Christ through the saints. So that's why sacred art becomes important to defend as a category, because, and I think I'll talk about this here later, but, the iconoclasts, they were really hitting fundamentally at the entire cult of images. And they were even saying things like, images are constrain God. If you try to depict the invisible nature of God, Christ in an icon, somehow that image constrains the divine nature. And it's like, what? No, that's not what's going on here. Images can actually have a positive, good meaning. And then given the surrounding historical context, a lot of people were thinking that, the tragedies that had befallen the empire were to be blamed on image veneration. So there's all that going on. And what Nicaea 2 is saying is, no, we have to defend that images have a sacred role. And then from there, I mentioned kind of the other two arguments. But then there is a historical argument here. It's not just totally theological. So the historical argument is that the church has an indefectible identity and that images are part of that indefectible identity of the church. So there is a historical argument here. And I do talk about later in the presentation, like falsification scenarios. So if it really was the case that images didn't appear until like 300, 400 years after Christianity began, then that would be a problem. Like if all of a sudden images just sprang out of nowhere, that would be a problem. Images have to be there from the very beginning. There has to be that historical continuity there. And then we can talk about too, maybe in the Q&A, what is the relationship between the theology and history in the council? Because, or actually, I think I'll talk about that later in this presentation. Okay, the fourth thing is that Nicaea 2 informally defines veneration broadly as simply any act or thought towards an image that recognizes the image as spiritually nourishing. There are examples of, talking about how when somebody carries the Gospels, it has become an object of veneration, right? It moves in with wonder and veneration. I think that was, I think it was Athanasius who said that. And then there are other examples too of people talking about venerating the manger, right? These types of practices. And so even on the upper right there, I have a quote from Leontios of Neapolis where he talks about, veneration can even be when you hold on to the garments of a loved one and you weep over it. That is venerating the garment, because through weeping on that garment, it's as if you're putting your tears on that loved one who's represented by those garments. And so the point is that veneration in Nicaea 2 is used very broadly, right? Now, this is where I think Gavin and I are going to have our fundamental difference. And this is important because you could read the broadness of how veneration is used in two ways. You could read that broadness flexibly, in the sense that veneration is to be understood as just this kind of broad, basic principle, right? Of showing, as I said here, just showing honor towards an image, and honor can come in all kinds of different forms, so on and so forth. Or you could view veneration in a universal quantifying sense of, bringing in all the members of that group. So To give an example, let's say that we were debating, I say something like money has always been around, and I define money as, any material object used in the exchange of goods to convey the value of those goods, right? Uh, okay, sure. Then you could say with that basic definition that, yeah, money has always been around. But somebody might look at that word money and think of the US dollar, or think of, the Indian rupee, or the British pound, and say, you're really saying that the American dollar was around during, or, the rupees were around during, first century Palestine? That's crazy. The point is that, with that word money or that word veneration, how broadly are we going to understand it? Because I would agree that there is a universal aspect to how veneration is used. When the council says, for example, the image veneration goes back to the apostles, some of the pseudo sources do say that Nicaea 2 uses, like I mentioned on page 165, the pseudo Basil quote, right? It does say that honor and image of images goes back to the apostles. With that, if veneration really does mean the whole gamut of, bowing, kissing, praying, looking on the image positively, if it includes that whole set, the entire members, okay, then that would mean no development, if that's what we read into the word veneration. But if we do read veneration in the way that I'm arguing, which I think Nicaea 2 is using it, in this broad, flexible, just basic, bare bones sense of any act or thought towards an image that recognizes the image as spiritually nourishing, then that does allow and make room for development, right? And so this is where I think the debate is really going to hinge. Because, I mean, both of them do the same work, right, of justifying the practice of image veneration, right? Because, both of them do the same work. Both of them have the same explanatory scope. The question is, which one is the most accurate? Is it using veneration to really mean all of that, all the technical meanings of veneration? So, for example, if they have a source that says in the 5th or 4th century, we got image veneration from the apostles, are we to read in that they meant or understood that to mean everything from bowing to kissing? Or was it just a basic sense of just honoring in whatever way images that has always been around, right? That's where I think this debate really turns on. What do we mean by veneration, or what do we think Nicaea 2 means by veneration? The fifth thing that I bring up is that if Gavin's interpretation were correct, we would expect Nicaea 2 to mention St. Luke's icon. I mean, crying out loud, if the debate is over whether or not the apostles bowed and kissed to images or had icons, and we can point out someone who was, a writer of scripture, who was with the apostles, a contemporary of them, who had an icon of Mary and Jesus, I mean, that would settle the debate. That would be such a powerful move, and it would make total sense, given Gavin's interpretive scheme, that the icon of St. Luke would be mentioned. But as Father Price points out in another essay, St. Luke's icon is not mentioned in Nicaea 2, although it was already part of, the kind of icona dual propaganda. But still, it's interesting that Nicaea 2 doesn't mention St. Luke's icon, when that would not only be such an easy, QED for them, but also it would make total sense if Gavin's interpretation were correct. Now, that's how Nicaea 2 is compatible with development, because it doesn't rule out that development could occur. It leaves that room there. It doesn't totally close and pinch that out. But what then allows me to say that Nicaea 2 implies development? Well, the first thing is that if it's the case that there is some wiggle room, that there is some space for development, then that would also imply development, right? If it doesn't totally close it out. And so, for example, if Nicaea leaves open the precise manner of apostolic icon veneration, then it's not really saying that that's what everything hinges on, exactly how the apostles venerated icons. Because if that were the case, then they would have just made that really clear. All right, we venerate icons because the apostles bowed and kissed to them, and so on and so forth. We are one for one corresponding to what the apostles were doing in the first century, right? There's that. The second thing is with the, not defending or kissing images by expressly claiming that the apostles also bowed and kissed to images. I think that also, once again, leaves room open for development. It's showing you that that's not the way of reasoning at the council. And that's significant because that was one of Gavin's points. What is the way of reasoning at the council? Moreover, when you look at the actual reasoning of the council, the arguments are really more kind of theological in substance, but there is some history that is to be there. And then when Nicaea 2 kind of broadly uses the word veneration, that also allows for some room. And that also allows us to, for example, if my interpretation is correct, that Nicaea 2 is using veneration in this kind of like basic principle way, the basic principle of veneration, of honoring images in whatever way was always there, then what you could do is you could say, well, it would make sense then that in each generation, the substance, the basic substance of image veneration was there, but the specific ways of venerating, the accidents as opposed to the substance, those shifted and changed over time and developed in different ways. And I mean, that's precisely then a development argument. That's precisely how development arguments work. They try to argue that the substance is there, and then the accidents are simply those things that visibly formed over time. And then once again, I do think that the fact that St. Luke's icon isn't mentioned in Nicaea 2 is significant. But I do want to present like two other arguments that I mentioned in the presentation for why Nicaea 2 implies development. So the second of this set down here is that the evidence used by the council itself suggests a development in how images were venerated. Not every generation venerated images in the same way if you look at the sources, nor did every generation in the recordings that they have kiss, bow, and pray to images. This suggests that Nicaea 2 did not require unchanging veneration practices for its decision. It just requires that veneration of some sort always occurred. And I think this argument combined with 4 really does tip the scales. Because if Nicaea 2 was using veneration in the universal sense, the sense of every member is included, such that if it says, this person was venerating images and that meant kissing, bowing, the whole gamut, right? Then this would conflict with how it uses the historical sources, where not every church father mentions, the kissing and bowing to images. The 4th and 5th century fathers mention how the images were put up in shops, in houses, how they were used to remember the saint, how they were used to call upon the saint for their intercession. These types of things that might be calling upon the intercession could be a form of prayer to the image. That's a possibility. But the point I'm making here is that Nicaea 2 doesn't require that every generation venerated images in the exact same way. Rather, Nicaea 2 is just saying, look, the fundamental substance of image veneration was there in the cult of the saints. And look at these generations after the apostles who had and understood the apostolic faith, who understood the theology of the apostles, who remained faithful and orthodox. And what did they do? Well, here are the different ways that they venerated images. So it's not saying that you need to, when it's referring to evidence for veneration, that you need the whole gamut. It's just saying, look, image veneration of various sorts was there. And that's what really matters. And so I do think that this then tips the scales. Once again, Nicaea 2 does not require unchanging veneration practices for its decision. It just requires that veneration of some sort always occurred. The third point that I want to make down here is that given that Nicaea 2 is responding to the iconoclasts, they are defending the fundamental validity of the cult of images. This is important because if you're just fundamentally defending the validity of the cult of images, then you don't have to focus so much time on defending, let's say, the specific antiquity of bowing, kissing, and praying to images. Because if you're just trying to defend the fundamental validity of the cult of images because your opponents are arguing against that fundamental validity, then all you need to do then is defend that the substance is there, that the groundwork is there, that there is a place for images in churches, that that images can have sacred and valuable uses, right? So basically, what I'm saying here is that Nicaea 2 isn't arguing in the way that Gavin, is expecting, if you will, because it's not arguing against Gavin. It's arguing against the iconoclasts who were rejecting the entire cult of images. And so in doing that, then Nicaea 2 is giving a broad defense of images. And I think by doing this broad defense of just the fundamental validity, this goes then into the structure of how a development argument works, which is the substance is what matters. And then the accidents, sure, they can change, they can move over time. But the fundamental validity of that cult of images is there in the church fathers and, going back to the apostles. And I remember too, Gavin had mentioned, the Father Price quote on how, they would, the fathers of Nicaea 2 would be perplexed by our debates because they weren't arguing that image veneration went back to the 1st century rather than the 7th century or the end of the 7th century. Rather, they were arguing that the fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries were giving us, image veneration, which goes back to the apostles themselves. And I also cited that same quote to explain the reasoning of the council. And I want to emphasize that there is then that question, what exactly is Nicaea 2 saying goes back to the apostles themselves? And then that gets us back into the contested passage, the interpretation that I offered for what is the this, and this is the faith of the apostles. And I think here, if the gist of Nicaea 2 is to defend the fundamental validity of the cult of images, given what the iconoclasts were doing, then they just need to defend the substance. And then other things like the accidents, those can be defended if the substance is just fundamentally there. That's why I'm saying that Nicaea 2, Gavin mentions this, and I'll mention this in the presentation later, how Nicaea 2 doesn't argue that this, and I think when he says this, he's referring to specifically bowing, praying, and kissing the images, is a development. And it's like, well, yeah, that's correct, because one is that this of Nicaea 2 is the cult of images, is the veneration of images on a general scale. Yes, I agree. That did not develop because that was always there. Image veneration and the cult of the images was always there from the very beginning of Christianity. That was my precise argument. But if you are trying to say that Nicaea 2, doesn't argue for the antiquity of bowing and kissing and praying to images, then I would say, yeah, it doesn't expressly do that because that's not its primary target. Its primary target is to defend the substance of image veneration so that it can also defend and justify its present, if you will, accidents of how it is building on that substance, of how it is outworking that substance of image veneration. And so I'll repeat this again, but I think that's also a really crucial point because that's something that Gavin has emphasized in his other video. All right. And then let's see. I wanted to emphasize here in session 6, where Nicaea 2 also summarizes its reasoning and the evidences that it has swayed it. And so here on page 480, it says, together with many things that have come down to us in an unwritten tradition, the making of icons has spread in the church since the time of the preaching of the apostles. All right, so the Nicaea 2 has no problem stating what they think explicitly did come from the apostles. But over and over and over again, the only thing that they explicitly say comes from the apostles are the making of images. And the story of the woman with the flow of blood, testified to by various historians, shows that she erected a statue of the Lord and of herself touching the foot of the statue. Going on, as regards writing, very many of our holy fathers have handed down that these images have their place among Christians. Basil the Great, whose teaching resounds to all the ends of the world, made mention of them in several of his discourses, as did Bishop Gregory of Nyssa, his brother in both flesh and spirit. In his sermon on Abraham, Gregory named the theologian in the poems he composed, which included discourse entitled On Virtue. John, who received the honorable name Chrysostom, in his funerary oration on Bishop Meletios of Antioch, and in his sermon entitled That the Old and New Covenants Have a Single Legislator. Cyril, the destroyer of Nestorius, in his letter to Bishop Acacius of Scythopolis, and also Anastasios of Thuopolis, Sophronius and Maximos. Why should we mention these by name? All our holy fathers accepted the making of images. They are speaking falsely who deny that is a tradition of the fathers, right? So notice that this is session 6 leading up to session 7, and session 7 occurred like a week after the debate had ended. A lot of time and care went into session 7, but as the council was reaching the end of session 6, or actually midway through session 6, excuse me, it's summarizing the evidence that came before, and it's simply saying the making of images, the making of images, the making of images. Images have a place among Christians, right? That sounds like they're arguing for the basic fundamental validity of the cult of images, that they do have a place, that they do belong, that they can have a holy purpose, these types of things. So that's worth mentioning when we go to the actual text of Nicaea 2. And to finally kind of drive the point home, I gave this analogy that might help you understand how I think Nicaea 2 is arguing. Because Nicaea 2 is looking at the clues basically left behind by the 4th and 5th century fathers, because these fathers were considered the bastions of orthodoxy. They really understood the apostolic teaching. They really were, kept to their guns and defended the teachings of Christ and the apostles. And using these kind of exemplary sources, they looked at how these men talked about images, and they saw left and right, as I presented in the original video, uh, all kinds of positive endorsements of images. None of this kind of images are bad, or all of them are intrinsically idolatrous, what have you. They clearly say that there are images in their cult. And in some way, going through those 4th and 5th century fathers reveals something about the apostolic teaching. Through them, you can get back to the apostles themselves. And so I use the analogy, for example, how, FBI agents and detectives, when they're investigating a crime scene, they can look at the clues left behind and use those clues to build a profile for what the perpetrator was like who left these clues behind, so they can figure out things like, did the person have a problem with their mother? Does the person have a stutter? What is the person's psychological makeup and profile? All these things. They're able to do that and get a kind of broad outline, a fundamental outline based on the clues left behind. And then similarly, what Nicaea II is doing with the 4th and 5th century fathers is using their theology and their kind of views on images to get at what is the apostolic profile, what is the general outline of what the apostles did and didn't say about images. And so that's kind of how I see the argument of Nicaea II working. Now to objection 2 on the fathers. So the first thing that I pointed out was there is a valid concern to be had on if the sources are talking about pagan images, you can't automatically assume then that that's a polemic against all images. So Robin Jensen, in her book From Idols to Icons, she says the following: the assumption that ancient Christians unfailingly and universally condemn pictorial art because they believed it to be idolatrous has endured, despite historians' attempts over the past half century to qualify this belief. Much of the persistence of this error derives from centuries of misreadings of Christian apologetic texts that disparage depictions of polytheist gods, wrongly judged to be sweeping and effective critiques of all types of religious pictorial art. This book came out, I believe, in either 2022, 2023. And so, Dr. Jensen here is showing that there's a shift working in scholarship and that they are trying to qualify a lot of the polemics that did. And she mentions John Calvin and the Reformers, who had caused this kind of, impression to be made, this reading of the ancient fathers. And so I do want to say then, in response to, kind of Gavin's use of the sources, that we need to be cautious, because if they are critiquing a specific kind of image, can we therefore move into a statement about all images? For example, it would be invalid to say that if I don't like rock concerts, therefore I don't like concerts. If I don't like rock concerts, then I don't like concerts. That would be a invalid inference to make, because maybe it's possible that I would like pop concerts or other kinds of concerts, but you can't make the conclusion, therefore, I would reject all concerts. But to be fair to Gavin, there is a way in which this argument could work, right? And the question is, do the sources articulate a principle that would rule out all cultic images? So, for example, if someone says, I don't like rock concerts because I don't like music, therefore, you could conclude then, yeah, that person's not going to like any concerts, because an essential part of concerts is music. And so, Gavin mentioned how when Catholic apologists and Orthodox apologists make this qualification on pagan images versus Christian images, they sound like progressive Christians who try to make invalid foreign distinctions. Well, the reason why those invalid foreign distinctions in sexual ethics don't work is because Paul does make a principled argument. He makes an argument from natural law, from the way in which we are made, right, on his sexual ethic. And so then you could say that, okay, no, it falls into the latter category, that Paul does articulate a universal argument on sexual conduct. And so it's then, to be cautious, are Gavin's sources actually relevant to the debate? Do they really actually touch close enough to what Nicaea II is saying, such that we can say, okay, there's some traction here? Or does it fall into the first category of a kind of argument where you try to say that I don't like concerts just because I don't like rock concerts? The church fathers here didn't like images because they didn't like pagan images. Those would both be kind of leaps of logic. And then, once again, it's tempting for both sides to read their position into the text when there are ambiguities. And I do want to admit that, there are ambiguities. There are times where I'm kind of like, I don't know how to interpret what this father's position was on images based on just the text in front of us. And so I try to use clues sometimes. Other times I'm willing to just say, I don't know. And so to review then, the three parts of that section of Gavin's 12 sources in his original, or I should say kind of more official icon veneration objection video, I found that 7 of them were simply inconclusive, right? You just don't know based on the sources what that father believed about images of, let's say, saints. So you have examples of Arnobius responding to how pagans would use rituals to call upon their gods to enter into the statues or enter into the images that they had. So that doesn't sound analogous to saint veneration. Irenaeus, for example, talks about how certain heretical groups would crown images, and they had images of Jesus made by Pontius Pilate alongside images of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. I mean, I don't know what to make of that. And I'm not trying to just be critical. I'm being serious that I don't know what to make of those passages on what that person believed about images in general. You have to be very careful. And there were other examples too, especially like Felix, when Felix talks about how the Christians don't have images, but images of what? They don't have images of the invisible God. That makes sense that they wouldn't have images of the invisible God. But what does that say about visible saints or Jesus Christ, who is God? Right? Once again, Felix is talking about apples when the discussion's on oranges, right? These are two separate issues. And so that's why I concluded that most of Gavin's sources are, I don't know what to do with them. I did say that, and then I did mention, and I should have put it here on the slide, Tertullian, I think, would be opposed to Nicaea too, because I think we've lost him on a fundamental level. Tertullian thought that simply if you made images, so he didn't think that all images were in themselves idolatrous, but he did believe that if you make images, you are kind of complicit in idol worship, because somebody could easily take that image and do something with it that's inappropriate. And even he thinks that, I think the practice of images is the practice of creating images goes back to the devil himself. So yeah, we've lost him. He's not going to support Nicaea too. So I'll give that one over. But there are other things that need to be mentioned. So the Synod of Elvira, based on William Albrecht's research and his conversation with even a recent scholar on this issue in Spain or from Spain, there's a debate that hasn't been settled among scholars on whether or not Canon 36 of the Synod of Elvira is actually authentic. Some scholars only believe maybe the first 10 are authentic. And so because of that, then, because the debate hasn't been settled, and also there are a lot of, I think, dissertations that need to be translated into English, we just don't know, right, on what the status is of the Synod of Elvira. With regard to Epiphanius, that episode where Epiphanius sees a curtain in a church of an image, and it says in the Latin text that, it must have been, maybe an image of Jesus or a saint. I don't recall. Epiphanius tears that down and says, do you not know about the injunction against idolatry, the second commandment? And then, all the rest is there. What William was able to find was an article by Charles Murray, and she argued in her essay in the Oxford Journal of, I think it was like Theological Studies, that the Greek text of Epiphanius gives you a different reading. The Latin text says that, it must have been, some type of image of Jesus or a saint, and therefore Epiphanius, eventually tears it down. But she points out that when you look at the Greek text, and a lot of the fathers who are working with this text were only working with the Latin text, the Greek text, the original language that Epiphanius had written this in, the image, it's very clearly an image of an idol. It's an image of a pagan god. And the people, it doesn't say Epiphanius said this, the people had mistakenly thought it was Jesus or some image of a saint. And when Epiphanius then tears down that curtain, it makes more sense than, what's going on. If somebody had an image of Odin in their church, just because it's a bearded guy and vaguely looks like Jesus, I would say, no, get that image of Odin out of the church, right? I mean, I would agree then with Epiphanius in this context. Epiphanius then starts making more sense when you take into account then the Greek wording. Now, somebody might say, but Swan, you didn't actually offer an argument, though, that the Greek text is more reliable than the Latin text. Now, I would say that I think that Charles Murray does that in her paper. But regardless, the fact that you then have this Greek text that leads to a radically different reading, that might even just take us to the fact that Epiphanius is inadmissible here until we conclude or can get our sources down on is the Greek or the Latin the true intention of Epiphanius, which one is more reliable. And so at least you could maybe soften this objection of mine to just saying, okay, it's inadmissible, rather than it's totally out of context. Regarding Gregory and Augustine, right, I do think that Gregory might need some convincing. The reason why I say that is because, and I put him in like the 50-50 region. The reason why is because when we look at the texts that Gavin had cited on the adoration of the image that Gregory was criticizing, and the people who had thrown away the images, but Gregory is saying, hey, you should have kept them because unlettered people, illiterate people could value from those images. We don't exactly know what was going on with the adoration of those images, right? Like, was it actually worship? Was it sacrificing things? Like that would be problematic, okay? But we don't know. But then Gregory elsewhere does talk about in one of his letters, and I mentioned this in the original PowerPoint. If you want to see the exact sources that I'm using, to save time, I'm not going through all the exact sources. Gregory mentions how images of Christ, of the Madonna and Child, and of the cross were stolen from a church and placed inside of a synagogue. And people were panicking. They were upset. They were threatening to go into that synagogue to, do really, mean things to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And Gregory tells everybody to, calm down and take the images outside of the synagogue with fitting veneration. And there are two translations of that William had given me. One was a translation that just simply said, with fitting veneration, take those images out of the church or out of the synagogue. Okay, well, in that sense, then veneration there wouldn't mean, bowing, kissing, and all that. It would just be like something like fitting care or respect, right? Which makes sense, because even I think that, if a Protestant held on to a beautiful image of Jesus, they would be very careful if it was expensive or, precious, to not carelessly just take it out of a place. Sure. But then another translation says those images which are worthy of veneration, which kind of gives a different slant on maybe what's going on there. But the bottom line that I want to make is, Gregory did think that the images had some value to them. He did think that they had some respectability, right? Some honor that is to be given to them. But we don't know how much. We don't know what exactly he meant by what the people were doing with the adoration of the images that he had condemned. So I'm just going to say, it's 50-50. I don't know. It's open. It's up in the air, right? I would say it's 50-50 because I could see it going either way based on the evidence, but I could also just as easily put him in the question mark category, because the question mark category is just for those things that I think are apples and oranges. With regard to Augustine, I argue that Augustine might be able to be swayed to Nicaea too, because even though Augustine kind of raises the argument that we don't, pray to chalices and vestments and instruments of the sacraments, because through them we pray unto God, right? I mean, one thing is that Augustine in that context is critiquing the pagan use of images. He is critiquing pagans who think somehow that, he even mentions that the pagans say, oh, well, we don't pray to the thing or worship the thing as if it is the God, but we worship the God who is represented in the image, right? Somebody might say, aha, there you go, Swan. That works then against the veneration of saints, because you don't say the saints in the image. You say you just use the image to venerate the saint who is in heaven. And my question is, would Augustine accept a jump? Would he accept that jump from what those pagans were saying to what Christians believe about the veneration of saints? And we actually do have in the text of Augustine, in his writings, he responds to the objection that the veneration of saints is like the worship of pagan deities, and he rejects that connection. And so if he rejects that connection, then I think we could actually maybe sway Augustine to Nicaea too. But once again, you could put him in the 50-50 category maybe. My bottom line here is that a lot of these sources, when we scrutinize them, don't get us the conclusion that I think Gavin was quite hoping for. Now, I do want to say a few things here about the sources really quick. One is that, let me make it expressly clear that I do not believe, and I don't want people to say this about Gavin, that he intentionally distorted things or somehow intentionally misrepresented them. No, I mean, I can totally understand with some of these, I had to go into the Greek with some of these, right? I had to go into the translation history into really intricate things. And maybe somebody was going to find a different translation or go into the Greek and critique my arguments. I'm not intentionally being misleading, and I don't think Gavin was doing that either. And what we're doing simply as scholars in this conversation is noting, you might have been able to handle, or maybe this source should have been handled a bit better. I don't quite agree with how you use that source. I don't quite agree that that's the interpretation there. This is not meant to be attacking Gavin's character at all, but it is to point out that I think there are issues here with how he's interpreting these passages. I think a lot of them are apples and oranges. Some of them have really important, interpretive textual histories that need to be mentioned, and other things in the corpus of that father that need to be brought out to nuance what's going on here. The other thing is too that someone might say, okay, well, Swan, look, maybe, at this point, you can't say that this constitutes a universal consensus against Nicaea II. Let me say that again. At this point, based on what I presented on Gavin's use of the sources, you really can't say that this is a universal consensus against Nicaea II when a lot of them don't even touch Nicaea II or aren't analogous to Nicaea II. So you could maybe shift the argument then to an argument from silence, where you say, well, look, but none of them speak in a Nicaea II kind of way, right? None of them speak positively about images or something like that. And my response then would be, okay, one, look, the argument's changing, which is fine, but note that it is changing from a universal consensus kind of contradiction argument to now a silence argument. But with that silence argument, I would then use the fathers that Nicaea II had cited to fill in the gap, because this isn't universally representative. And I don't think Gavin was intending for this to be universally representative. This does not constitute everything that the fathers have said about images. And so then using Nicaea II sources, we can bridge the gap from the apostles to the council itself. And so either way, I think, I think that what Gavin has said about the fathers here can be made sense of. It doesn't constitute a universal consensus. Would the fathers have recognized Nicaea II as a valid development? Well, I go into that with, Gregory might need convincing, Augustine could be convinced. But notice that, there are three different ways that this argument could be run. And that's why I'm saying I'm kind of, whenever somebody just lists out quotes from the church fathers, I want to know, what exactly are you saying? Are you making one claim from all the quotes? Are you saying each of the quotes have a distinct argument? How are they playing in the dialectic? Because you could do a universal consensus contradiction argument. You could make an argument from silence based on all of these put together, or you could make an argument that each of these fathers would not have recognized, right? Those are three different ways to use the same 12 sources. And this is why, this debate gets really complicated, because this can go in all kinds of different directions. And so narrowing down, what is the target? What are we looking at? That's important. When I went into the history of icon veneration, I looked at, for example, art, widespread use of art in the cult of saints in Second Temple Judaism and present in Jesus's day. The tombs of saints were decorated and venerated. So, for example, I mentioned how in Cassius Dio's Roman history, during the Bar Kokhba revolt around the 130s AD, he mentions this is there's a reason why I included that, because scholars on Second Temple Judaism will typically end the Second Temple period, not at the destruction of the Second Temple, but kind of during the Bar Kokhba revolt, because that kind of constitutes the last strand before you get to Rabbinic Judaism at the end of the 2nd century. So Cassius Dio mentions that the tomb of Solomon was an object of veneration. And then when you go into like passages like Tobit chapter 4, verse 17, where it says, pour out your food, give your food, share your food, and pour out your wine on the grave of the righteous, but not on the graves of the wicked. The tombs themselves were being honored or venerated. Things were being done to the tomb as a way to honor the person who was contained therein, or the person who really, by that point, was in heaven in the abode with God. And then similarly with the Old Testament, we see that the Israelites bowed and prayed to the temple. So we do have then a cultic practice of bowing and praying to an artifact, to an object. And this temple itself was filled with images. And I did argue that this is part of an ongoing development of images among God's people in the Old Testament. As I mentioned before with Moses could only make those things that God had commissioned and follow his specific design. Eventually, you get to the point where David can design the temple. He gives it to Solomon to complete. And then eventually under, like King Hezekiah, you have images all over the place, people building and constructing them and using images freely. There's this impression among some people that the ancient Israelites and Second Temple Jews were, so pious. They didn't have any images except for those in the temple. And if they had images, it was because the emperor or Caesar forced them to use pagan images on their coins, and that's it. No. Images had a place in Judaism already during the time of Jesus. And so we see from the Old Testament then that persons and artifacts close to God are venerated. And I think one of the principles that I pointed out is as the barrier between heaven and earth began to shrink in the Old Testament, the cult around images also was impacted. So as the Israelites came closer and closer to the promised land, and then they were finally in it, you went from not having any images to now you could have the Ark of the Covenant, God dwelling with his people. You could have Joshua in Joshua 7:6, praying before the Ark. And then you could eventually have people praying and bowing to the temple. There's a movement going on, and that movement is explained because once the Davidic monarchy is established, and once there isn't any longer, the tribe being a nomadic group that's out in the desert that can be easily influenced by any surrounding people, but now the city, the kingdom is established. The king is the head of the temple and can protect the cult. That then allowed for some restrictions around images to be loosened. And so one question that I kind of posed is, if that's the trend, then what happens when God incarnate comes, builds his church, defeats the powers of death? What happens then to the cult around images? What happens when that gap between heaven and earth is so closed now that the incarnation can hold both heaven and earth within it? That's something, worth keeping in mind. Of course, that argument could be developed a bit more, but I do want to say that, okay, there are some things in the Old Testament that will surprise you about images and how they were used. We can't leave that out, especially since Gavin said that Joshua 7:6 was a one-off event. And my argument is precisely, no, it wasn't a one-off event. The practice of bowing and praying to the temple, or really the Ark, which was like a symbol of the temple, a proto-temple, that continued into Jewish history. And even, in fact, I think in rabbinic times, and some contemporary Jews might still pray to the east, if I'm not mistaken, they called this Mizrah, that practice of praying east, of praying towards Jerusalem and the temple. So that remained for a long time. And then I proposed like various apostolic scenarios. And, here I want to defend first Nicaea II's use of Golden Age fathers, why that's good historical methodology. And then second, Nicaea II's claims being historically plausible. So regarding Nicaea II's use of Golden Age fathers, this was in a different part in the original presentation, but I thought it would be good to use it here. Somebody might say, but Swan, isn't it bad to use sources like in the 4th and 5th century when we're talking about what happened in the 1st century? And it's like, sure, you could make an objection like that. I know some historians and scholars will do that. But there is a sense in which if a source really does understand the theology of the apostles, you can then make historical inferences on what the apostles taught. Let me give you an example. If someone theologically taught, let's say that they were in the tradition of the apostles, that they had received that unwritten tradition and were trained by someone who was trained by the apostles, and they taught something like Jesus isn't God, you would know, based on that theology, that historically, that person does not have the theology of the apostles. So notice that you can use theology to get at the history of what the apostles taught. So Nicaea II then used the Golden Age fathers, the 4th and 5th century fathers around Nicaea I, in order to get at what is the historical teaching of the apostles based on the orthodox theology of those men who kept the tradition, who kept the faith, who kept the theology of the apostles. And thereby using their orthodox theology, you can get back at the original history of what the apostles themselves taught. And so, I would argue that that's a valid way to use, to bridge, connect theology and history. And then I did offer arguments or scenarios by which Nicaea II's claims are historically plausible. And I think I'll discuss that in this presentation. But I want to keep clear that what I am saying, and I'm saying this with, let's say, historical certainty, is that the apostles in some way venerated images and cultic use of images was there from the very beginning of Christianity. Now, when people said, "Oh, but Swan, you only proposed scenarios and you were kind of speculating," yeah, we don't know the precise manner, but that profile, that they venerated images, and had, let's say, a cult of images around the cult of the saints. I am arguing that we can be historically certain that that is the case. So I am putting that argument forward. Now, somebody might say, Swan, so you just said that the apostles are bowing and kissing the images because you just said image veneration has been there since the beginning. No, because like Nicaea 2, I'm defining veneration broadly. And even Nicaea 2 defines the word image very broadly as well. And we'll get to that. But I do want to make that clarification, right? What is speculated is how exactly that occurred, but that it occurred is what I'm saying that definitely historically happened. And so that can be the basis then for, doctrine and so on and so forth. It's not, I'm not basing it on the speculation. I'm basing it on that fact that it really did happen in some way. We don't know quite how. And then when it comes to what is a plausible development, because you have to lay out that explanation or else we're just talking past each other. A valid development for a doctrine is when that doctrine is true, but the understanding of that doctrine needed time to develop and change. Whereas for a cultic development, what you need for a cultic development is the doctrine and then some explanation or a reason for, why that doctrine has a cultic application and how that cultic application can be changed. So there's actually three things going on. You need that underlying doctrine that validates the cultic practice. You need to show how you can validly connect that doctrine to the cultic practice. And then when you need to explain how that cultic practice developed, you also need to have that explanation there, right? And so for the cultic development of the veneration of images, the underlying doctrine is the veneration of saints. How can you then venerate saints through their images? The veneration principle. But then when you have developments in saint veneration and you have, the recognition that, the saints are really alive and so we can treat them like living people, then we can use their images in that way. The veneration principle allows then for increasing and changing cultic applications. So there is then the conditions satisfied for a plausible doctrinal development. I know that Newman and others would lay out their conditions. What I'm trying to do is get a very simple, bare bones definition. And I think this is, a totally good one. If you want to object to that, then we can talk about that. And so when I talked about like how did the apostles venerate icons, I did note that first art was usually expensive. All right. So you could make art though with vulgar tools, but if you make them with vulgar tools, there's not a great possibility that they're going to last for a long time. Whereas if you make them with like really nice mosaics, like we have houses in the Herodian period that have images of birds, etc., those will probably last the test of time. So if the early Christians, didn't have a lot of money, then they wouldn't be, making these really nice monuments that are going to last for a long time. And then also somebody might say, but Swan, if you're saying that the Christians venerated images, then wouldn't somebody have said something about it? Well, no, if the early Christian image veneration didn't look too different from their surroundings, especially from their Jewish brothers and sisters who had art already in the cult of the veneration of saints. And so I described, for example, here are some scenarios, but that something like this occurred, I think I'm certain. But how exactly that manifested, these are best guesses. Please keep in mind that distinction. So I would argue that the early Christians venerated and decorated the tombs of their saints. I added in relics. I don't know why, but I think I could see maybe relics being decorated as well. But it's really the tombs that I'm trying to emphasize here. These tomb decorations are perhaps the prototype of icons. The tomb was venerated, and decorations there, a menorah, birds, a rosette, are part of the cult of the saint. The reason why I mentioned the menorah, birds, and rosette is because these were images that you can find on ossuaries. I don't know about birds, but menorah and rosette, yes, those were on ossuaries that you find during the time. And these images were used to somehow call to mind that person's life or something about them. It was meant to communicate and express something about that individual. Maybe maybe there's a hypothesis that it might have conveyed social standing, but that's not too well corroborated. You know, a menorah could be a symbol of light in the afterlife, something like that. Who knows? Um, but yeah, so I think these tombs were venerated with decorations there as part of the cult of the saints. Going on then to early Christians, mourning the deceased, holding on to relics and other visible reminders of them, especially during Eucharistic celebrations. So Tobit 4:17 says, "Pour out your food and your wine on the grave of the righteous, but do not give it to sinners." So notice that the tombs themselves were objects that could be venerated. You could do things to the tomb, and by that you could then honor the one who is contained therein, right? You are honoring the righteous, and you don't want to do this same act though to the tomb of sinners because you don't want to honor them. You want to honor the righteous who are contained therein. And so, you know, there's an example then of maybe you could say even Eucharistic imagery of food and wine there. I mean, it doesn't say bread, so maybe that might be reading things in. But early Christians, you know, using relics or other visible reminders of that person while they were mourning them, I could totally see that being a plausible scenario. And, you know, the connection between relics and images is that both are visible reminders of that saint. Both are visible ways of drawing you to that saint, their life, their legacy, and what they are doing in heaven. Right? It brings the form, the image of that saint to the mind. I think it was Nicaea 2 talks about the eyes of the mind, right, going to the saint. So those relics and those images, they have that function. And in fact, Nicaea 2 would consider relics, if I'm not mistaken, or I think it was actually just anything basically visible, like an imprint of someone's face. Like, for example, you know, the image that King Akbar had. Although, you know, that's considered by many people to not be an authentic story. But anyway, that image was considered an image made without hands, right? And so I think the idea is just simply you can use visible objects to remind you of the saint. That's how Nicaea 2 is putting relics and icons together. The visible object that moves the eyes of the mind to the form of the saint. The other thing, too, is that early Christians reinterpreted pagan images for Christian purposes, with some images, like the Good Shepherd, gaining widespread traction in the cult. So if you're trying to look for archaeological evidence of images in early Christianity, I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell, because what if in the earliest days of the church, they were already using the pagan images for, like, oh, you know, that image kind of looks like Stephen. Okay, we're going to remember that image as being Stephen who was martyred, right? Well, then when you go back in the archaeological record, you'll just see, let's say, a statue of some emperor, and you'll think, okay, well, that's a Roman statue, no place in the Christian cult. You know, you can't dig up intentions, you can't dig up motivations. You have only what you have in the text, perhaps, that are left behind by the early Christians. And to quote from Laura Nasrallah in her book, Christian Responses to Roman Art and Architecture, she says, quote, "It is also clear that Christians from the very start used commonly available images and applied their own meanings to them. According to Clement of Alexandria, the same Clement who talks about rotting away with your idols, a signet ring picturing a ship properly understood can be a Christian symbol." And I think the early Christians got this practice from Jesus himself. So in Matthew 22:21 and Mark 12:17, this is the famous passage where, you know, Jesus is confronted on whether or not we should pay taxes to Caesar. And then Jesus says, whose image is on the coin? They say Caesar's. And then Jesus says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, render unto God what belongs to God. Jesus took a pagan image and made a valid theological point out of it. And so I think the early Christians got that practice of converting pagan images to Christian uses from Jesus Christ. And so if that's the case then, and in the surrounding environment, you already have the cult of saints, you already have the use of art to remember the saints. In fact, I was going to mention that in Matthew 23, Jesus, when he's critiquing the Pharisees, he mentions how the Pharisees, build monuments to the righteous and decorate the tombs of the righteous. Like, okay, you know, the tombs were venerated. Jesus mentions that the Pharisees were doing this in the New Testament. Now, he doesn't condemn that practice, but he's using it to show their hypocrisy, because, you know, they then went on to say, oh, we wouldn't have killed the prophet if that prophet, that righteous person, if we were back when our fathers were alive. And then Jesus is saying, you know, but then what about me, basically? But the point I want to make with all of these is that I do think these are historically plausible scenarios. This is a bit of guesswork, but this really does fit within the historical context. So Nicaea II's claim that image veneration, veneration broadly defined, images even broadly defined, were always part of the cult being that cult of saints. That is historically certain. And then now here are just historically plausible scenarios by which that might manifest. And then I do want to mention here, just if you're wondering, like, wait, what? There was a cult of saints in Second Temple Judaism. William Horbury has a paper, and I cited this quote in the original presentation, The Cult of Christ and the Cult of the Saints. Quote, "For the holy and righteous of ancient Judaism, the anniversary of death will also in some cases have been marked with fasting and with eulogy, and sometimes with assembly at tombs. But a further range of public commemorative practices come into view, connected with biblical reading, prayer, and festivals." So among Second Temple Jews, ancient Jews, they did have, celebrations and feast days for their saints. They did go out and do things to celebrate that saint's life. They did sometimes assemble around the tombs themselves. And even in Acts 2:29, I think it's Peter who alludes to the fact that they know where David's tomb is. Matthew also attests to the idea that the tombs of the prophets were known because they rise up and go into Jerusalem after the resurrection of Jesus, right? This is all part of that cultural environment, that cultural consciousness, that religious consciousness of the cult around the veneration of tombs and the veneration of saints. So you do have an object that represented the person being venerated. And so I give that complete picture once again, where with the ancient Israelites, you get to venerating artifacts and persons close to God. And then in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, you have art in the cult of saints, hence a cultic use of art. And you can then build up with the two, images being in that cult because of the veneration principle. And then the veneration principle allows you to transfer whatever veneration you would give to that saint to the image, or through the image rather. So that's how all of this is working together. Now, going forward, I do want to specify that I think the severe problem here is how we're using our terms, because I think this is where a lot of the debate hinges. For example, veneration is really wide. I mean, when we think about the word veneration, you think very particularly about bowing, kissing, praying, what the Orthodox and Catholics do today. But I mean, veneration just means honor, respect, reverence, right? And think about how broad the word honor is, how broad the word respect is. I mean, take the word icon, which, just means image. When you hear the word icon, you might think immediately about Byzantine icons. But no, the flexibility there is much wider than you would realize. And then even, Nicaea II talks about, relics, I think, or just simply even things that aren't made by hands can count as icons if they are visible reminders of that saint. And then Gavin does say in one of his videos that what he's targeting is the cultic use of images, where he defined it as praying, bowing, and kissing the image. And what I'm saying here is I'm rejecting Gavin's definition or restriction of the meaning of cultic use of images, right? The reason why I'm rejecting that is because, I'll get into that, but my definition of cultic use of images is communal or communally validated practices for the sake of cultivating devotion within the religious narrative or worldview or consciousness, right? And this definition of mine actually comes from one of my professors, Shia Cohen. His lecture, you can find it online, on when he defines like the cult in ancient Israel. He kind of uses this definition of cultivating devotion. And so one of the reasons why I reject Gavin's definition of the cultic use of images is because Nicaea II is not primarily defending the antiquity of kissing, bowing, and praying to images, but rather the entire practice, right? The basic fundamental validity of the practice of venerating, honoring, and having images of saints in churches and elsewhere. The iconoclasts were making a much wider claim than Gavin's quite precise and restricted one. And I even mentioned in the presentation that Nicaea would say, with me and Gavin, look, you two agree on image veneration, but you just disagree on what kind of veneration is permissible. So Nicaea II left veneration broad for a good reason in response to a broad iconoclastic objection. I mean, the iconoclasts would shudder because Gavin did say that he thinks it's okay for images to be in churches. And if that's the case, then you realize Nicaea 2, it's not going to neatly be responding to Gavin's objections because it's responding to a particular group of people who had their particular objection. And so you need to do that translation work, just as I said, it would be like translating from Greek to Latin to English, the New Testament. Similarly, with responding to Gavin, I need to translate from Nicaea 2 to the iconoclast, from the iconoclast then to Gavin. Like I have to do that interpretive work. There's a lot that's going on. And so Nicaea 2 left veneration broad for a good reason in response to a broad objection. And remember, I talked about how you can interpret that broadness as being containing every member of the set, or just being a broad, simply a basic principle of, honoring images in some way, whatever way that is. But still, both of them would get you the conclusion of the universal validity of venerating images, even during the time of Nicaea 2. I hope that makes sense. And then even, with Gavin's definition of cultic use of images, what do you do with John Chrysostom's story about Christians putting up images of saints, in memory of him and to call upon his intercession? Wouldn't that be a cultic use of images as well? That's part of the cult of the saints, to have that image there in shops and stores and so on and so forth. And so that's why I'm saying it doesn't seem like a good definition. Now, Gavin might say, okay, look, I see what you're saying, Swan, that's fine. What I'm just emphasizing is that kissing, bowing, and praying to icons is the problem. If that's the debate, then the debate is not over necessarily how to interpret Nicaea 2. The debate comes down to the doctrine of the veneration of saints and the validity of the veneration principle. Can veneration of saints and the veneration principle get you to kissing, bowing, and praying to icons? That seems to be the real question, if that's the objection at the heart of it. But we have to be careful, because we can't just say, oh, kissing, bowing, and praying to icons, that's what Nicaea 2 is primarily responding to. No, Nicaea 2 is responding to not contemporary Protestants, but the iconoclasts of their time. And so the primary emphasis and concerns are going to be different. So I think this debate needs to actually be split into two different directions, or two different sections. The first thing is, do we understand Nicaea 2 on its own terms? It's an exegetical question, right? And then we can look into, do we agree with how Nicaea 2 defined its terms? So that's going to be then a debate on the theology of Nicaea 2, but we can't mix these two questions together, right? We need to understand, let's say that we disagree with how broadly Nicaea 2 defined veneration, because we think, oh, well, those veneration practices aren't problematic. Having an image in your church, using the image to remember the saint, that's not problematic. Oh, but bowing, kissing, and praying, that's problematic. Well, then you don't disagree. You disagree on how Nicaea 2 defined its terms. But can we at least agree that when Nicaea 2 defined its terms, it did so broadly and left open a lot of ambiguity, and seems to just be appealing to a basic substantial principle to validate, its present use of or practice of veneration? So these are two distinct questions that need to be answered, because then that's going to get at the heart of the debate. Because the first question is going to deal with the development objections, and then the next question is going to deal with the actual theology and meat and substance of what's going on. But you can't mix these questions together. You need to understand Nicaea 2, and then we can ask, why should we agree with Nicaea 2? Now, Gavin did say in his brief response to me, I think it was like a 7-minute response, because it was combined with Trent Horn's video on the canon, that Nicaea 2 does not argue for this as a development. Well, what does Gavin mean by this as a development? So, Nicaea 2, when it talks about this, as in this is the faith of the apostles, when you look at the 3 parts of the decree, it does mention that images are venerable and holy. And yes, I would then argue that, yeah, that isn't a development. So Nicaea 2 doesn't have to argue for the development of image, that image veneration is a development. No, image veneration is a constant. That was always there, in veneration broadly defined. But then how exactly those images were venerated, yeah, that developed. But image veneration is a constant. The cultic use of images, where we define the cultic use of images as being images in the cult of saints. Yeah, I agree. That has also always been around. There was no development there, There was always a cultic use of images. But if you mean this, as in kissing, bowing, and praying to icons, well, the first thing I would say is that Nicaea 2 does not define the this of its teaching that narrowly. So it's almost like, well, you're kind of missing the point of Nicaea 2. But to also emphasize another thing, Nicaea 2 is defending the fundamental validity of the cult of images. Specific practices or specific veneration styles, therefore, don't need to be constant or always there if the principles undergirding them were always valid, because you're defending the fundamental validity. So Nicaea 2, actually, what I'm saying is, based on the interpretation that I have here, it doesn't, and based on the fact of who it's responding to, the iconoclasts and their specific objections in their historical context, Nicaea 2 doesn't have to defend the antiquity specifically of kissing, bowing, and praying to icons. Maybe it doesn't have to do that. All it needs to do, and what it is doing, is defending the fundamental validity of the cult of images itself. And so all it needs to do then is show, okay, look, image veneration has always been there. There's always been a cultic use of images, and these images are good. They're valid. They have a place in the church. And, we can connect it then to the cult of the saints through the veneration principle. But the idea that it needs to defend specifically narrowly, right, these practices, it doesn't need to do that if what it's defending is the fundamental validity, the substance of the cult. And so once again, here's my thesis, that there is a plausible case to be made of development from the apostles to Nicaea 2 on the matter of image veneration. I responded to Gavin's objections, and now I am open to questions. So let me return to the stream now, and let's see how long did I go for. Okay, 136. That is going to be helpful. So hopefully, this is a lot more manageable. I know that some of you might want the specific sources. And if you want the specific sources, the PowerPoint is on academia.edu. And I also, have the 4-hour video. I also do want to mention that I do have the desire to, one, study, the issue of anathemas more, because I think that's going to be a hot topic. And I've been developing some thoughts there. But the other thing, too, is that I want to look at the pseudonymous sources again to just confirm that none of them said something about kissing and bowing to images, right? That the apostles exactly had done that. Because if you can do that, right, then the thesis would collapse. And then you could argue there is no room for development. But some of the pseudo sources do say that they got image veneration from the apostles, even though they're pseudonymous, like, Basil's quote on 165. I'm not opposed, actually, to the content of the quote. I do think image veneration did come from the apostles and was always there based on the Second Temple Jewish practice of venerating tombs that were decorated with images. So I hope that all makes sense. But there is some final research to be done. But from what I recall and from the research I've done with the Catholic brothers, I think we're confident that, there's no place where it says the apostles kissed and bowed to images and therefore we do it because they did it. All right, let me see if I can find some questions here. Old Ben Kenobi asks, if there are legitimate questions about iconography, should we err on the side of glorifying God alone and refrain from kneeling, bowing, and praying to icons / the saints they represent? So there's a lot going on in this question, actually. If there are legitimate questions, that's the conditional, right? Are there legitimate questions about iconography? I'm going to argue that Nicaea 2 got it right, and it is an infallible council, and I think that I can support it. Now, I don't think Nicaea 2's infallibility comes from the strength of its arguments. I think Nicaea 2's infallibility, literally, infallibility comes from God. It comes from the Holy Spirit. And so I think the Holy Spirit protected the council. And you can look at the reasoning, the arguments, but it's really God who protected the council. Should we err on the side of glorifying God alone? Well, even if there are questions about iconography, that wouldn't mean, soli Deo gratia, if I got that right. No. Okay, glory to God alone. Sorry, no. See, my Latin's bad, so there it is. But the conclusion wouldn't follow that you could only glorify God alone, even if there are questions about iconography, because even the iconoclasts, right? They venerated saints, but they thought you should only, so they venerated saints, they worshiped God, but they didn't have icons, right? So it doesn't automatically follow that God alone could be the only one worshipped at that point. So that's just a point on logic. And then refrain from kneeling, bowing, and praying to icons / the saints they represent. Sure, if there are legitimate questions, then you would want to refrain from doing that, right? But if there aren't, let's say, legitimate questions, if the debate has been settled, then that changes things. I hope that makes sense. All right, let's see here what else we can say. The catechumen says, "What up, Suan?" That's so funny. People always, it's one syllable, swan, not Suan or Suan. It's one. So the fathers of the council did not believe that the apostles venerate icons? Question mark. No, that's not what I'm saying. I think the council is saying that somehow image veneration goes back to the apostles. It goes back to them, but it doesn't really specify how exactly the apostles venerated those icons. So old Ben Kenobi then asked a good follow-up question, which is, why didn't the apostles bow and kiss images? And my answer is, I don't know if they bowed or kissed images or didn't bow and kissed images, right? I don't know the answer to that question of did they or did they not do that. What I can say, though, is that even if they didn't, that wouldn't be a problem. Because take, for example, the practice of adoring the Eucharist in the Latin West. You could point out that, yeah, that was a development, I think, in the Middle Ages. If I'm wrong, then please forgive me. But that was a later development, and it occurred within the Latin Church. Why weren't people praying and venerating and worshiping, the Eucharist before then? Well, they were, but not in the specific way that the Latins were doing it, putting it in a monstrance or whatever. That was a specific development that occurred in the Latin Church. That doesn't mean that people before then didn't deny the real presence or deny that the Eucharist could be adored in a way. It's just people thought over time of different ways that you could then take transubstantiation, take the real presence, and have cultic applications to that. And so, even if the apostles didn't bow and kiss to images, it wouldn't fall under the anathema of Nicaea II, because I don't think they were consciously refusing. It was just that's not what they were doing during the time. I think that's the simplest explanation. And then old Ben Kenobi asks, can't we have images that are useful for teaching but not bow to them? Can, as in like metaphysical possibility? Sure, right? But may we have images that are useful for teaching but not bow to them? I mean, I don't think with any of the icons in my house I've ever bowed to them, but I have bowed to icons during divine liturgy, right? So you could have icons for teaching, but if you're going to say universally, let's say as a Catholic, right? Because you're under the law of the church. If the Catholic tries to say, I refuse to venerate an icon or bow to it and just use it for teaching purposes, then you wouldn't be automatically like anathematized, because anathemas have a legal technical meaning too, an application, but you're not in the right place if you're doing that as a Catholic. If there are different kinds of veneration, could some be appropriate and some be idolatrous? I think this was Gavin's original concern. Yeah, so this is good because there are, Nicaea II does talk about examples in which, or lays out examples, and even the church fathers lay out examples of image veneration that would be bad. So, for example, take Arnobius. If you actually think the saint is inside the image, you're crazy, right? That's not a good practice. Even the Catholic brothers had mentioned how, sometimes a Marian devotion, we love the Blessed Mother, but some people were treating like a statue of Mary, like believing that it's like the real presence of Mary, like how Jesus is present in the Eucharist. And it's like, no, okay, those are separate things, right? The honor you give to the type passes to the prototype. It's not the same thing, though. You need to be careful about that. I would also add, too, that giving sacrifices, in Catholic theology and Orthodox theology, that's a big no-no unless it's to God, right? And specifically the sacrifice of the Mass. You don't want to be doing things like sacrificing, animals and stuff like that to an image. That's a big no. And somebody might ask the question then, what about worshiping an image of Jesus? Because if the honor given to the type passes to the prototype, then you can just worship Jesus through that image, right? I mean, isn't that a way that you could justify worshiping the image? And the point I'd make here is that to use maybe a funny story, and I used this on Dustin Quick's channel the other night. You know, the veneration principle, Nicaea 2 argues that it's true based on common sense, really. It says the nature reality reveals the veneration principle is correct. I think Terastios was the one who said that. And even in the Bible, I think in, like I mentioned, Hebrews, there are indications that the veneration principle was considered valid, right? Because it was used to defend how Jesus is the exact representation of God the Father. And so Jesus is, still in the form of God. He is still validly receiving worship, and that worship goes to God. So mixing in some Athanasius and Basil there. So the veneration principle is true, but there are some things that you shouldn't do because it's just not appropriate, even if the veneration principle is true. So, if you kiss an image of a loved one, you're communicating that you love that loved one. If you kiss, let's say you kiss towards, you're on a FaceTime call and you kiss towards the image of the person on the screen, you're communicating that you're giving a kiss to that person. Now, I wouldn't suggest putting your lip on the phone screen. That's not good. But, kissing towards the screen, that shows you're giving a kiss towards the person, right? That's valid. That's good. But suppose I said, you know what? When I was in high school, I was in speech and debate, and we had finished the state championship tournament. I was kind of exhausted, but it was prom. And what if I told my prom date, you know what? The veneration principle, right? So the honor given to the type passes to the prototype. I'll just bring your image with me to the dance instead of me having to go pick you up and do all this, and we can just enjoy the night that way. There's the veneration principle, right? The honor given to the type passes to the prototype. If you want punch, I can pour you a glass, but I'm really just pouring it to your image. My prom date would not have been okay with that, right? Because even though the veneration principle is true, there are some things that should be done in a different way, in a more direct, intimate way. Similarly with worship, when you are worshiping God and giving your whole life and being, and you're putting that in the liturgy, and you're doing the sacrifice of the Mass, you're celebrating it, like that prom date example, that isn't something where you want to use the veneration principle, right? Because you want to be, you want God there. You want the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist there. And you want to give that worship directly to him in the Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament. And so that would be a way in which I would explain then limits on veneration. And even Nicaea 2 is very keen on not worshiping an image of Jesus, but also just using it as a source of veneration, as a source of inspiration. How are you sure all of your iconic saints are actually saints? What if they really did a good job of faking it and Jesus told them, I never knew you? So this is where I would trust the indefectibility of the church. And then also, I think it was John Joy on my channel who argued that more recently with the update in how saints are canonized, it's now infallibly certain that the saints that we have are, real saints. And also miracles are involved. And, I think this is just a kind of what if question. But in terms of I trust Christ and therefore I trust the church. Old Ben Kenobi says, how can the church say that those who refuse to venerate images are anathema? What if, like the weak Corinthian Christians, they are obeying their conscience in a desire to refrain from idolatry? So, once again, I said I was going to save the anathemas for another time. So I'm going to be careful on how much I contribute as an answer. Because, this is still something I want to research and be very careful about, because I realize this is the sensitive issue. We can deal with the development stuff and the interpretation. We can deal with all that, but it's really the anathemas that are hitting home for a lot of people, right? So going back to the argument of Nicaea 2 in the decree, the seventh session, it talks about how images are part of the indefectible identity of the church. That's my dubbing of the argument. There's a lot more details. It doesn't use, I think, the words indefectible identity. That's my title given to it. But basically, it's like Nicaea 2 is saying, this is part of our identity as the church. This is our family heritage. Imagine if, part of, let's say, being a member of the Sona family, my grandmother passed away a few months ago, that what we would do for my grandmother is we would go out and sing a song, on, let's say, using some tribal instruments from back home. And let's say I just say, I refuse to participate in that. I refuse. In some way, in a very deep way, especially to my father, because he was very close to my grandmother, that would really constitute a severance, a departure from the family. And so when you realize that images are really part of the Christian or the Catholic and Orthodox life, a part of liturgy, even connected back to the doctrine of the veneration of saints, which is connected to the doctrine of the incarnation, that really what the veneration of images is us parading and celebrating that the incarnation has conquered death, that the incarnation has created a kingdom, and now we see the princes and princesses of that kingdom. If you say we cannot celebrate those images, if we cannot venerate them, if we cannot, put those pieces together of venerating the saints and the veneration principle, then that really does start messing with a lot of things in the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition. It starts hitting at, the veneration of saints. If a Latin Catholic, for example, said they didn't want to adore the Eucharist because they thought it was idolatry, the question you could ask then is, do you not believe that's the real presence of Jesus Christ? And if that's the case, then that would be a radical departure. That would be something that would break ground, that would break communion. And then, obviously, there are people who might feel uncomfortable, who are trying to obey their conscience. And I mean, the church wouldn't coerce them into the church wouldn't force them to bow and venerate an icon. But the church would say at that point, then, you're not in communion with us. And you need to refrain, right, from the sacraments until you're ready to repent. Because what you're saying then in doing that with your conscience is you're saying the church is wrong on a matter that it infallibly settled. And so then once again, that's hitting the identity portion and the indefectible portion of the church, that the church has this indefectible identity. So wrapped up then in the veneration of saints and the veneration of images, you're actually hitting a whole lot of things at once if you reject the veneration of images. Let's see here. And also, if you send in super chats, that might help me navigate a bit, but there's no need to. I'm going to try my best. I just don't want to have these awkward silences. Okay, there seems to be a debate going on in the live chat, so I'll let that continue. Okay, yeah. So here, this is a good point. I could be wrong, but I don't think Gavin has said that all icon veneration is bad, but that some is and the line can be blurry. But he doesn't feel comfortable venerating icons, and because the church says those who refuse to venerate are anathema, he cannot be part of the Roman Catholic Church. Notice the anathemas are coming up again, so I really got to do some research here and do a presentation soon enough. But yeah, Gavin does not think all icon veneration is bad. And if you are a Catholic in this conversation or an Orthodox in this conversation, please stop accusing Gavin of saying that. He never said that. What Gavin has said is that art can have a valid aesthetic purpose, a commemorative purpose, a didactic purpose. He acknowledges these kinds of uses for art. And in that way, then you could say icon veneration or image veneration. Although I don't think Gavin has ever said anything like, oh, I would venerate an icon in these ways. He does say images have a valid use. Okay, that's different though. So, even the way you're using icon veneration is actually closer to how I'm using it, right? Which I appreciate. But then going on then to this last part here, because the church says those who refuse to venerate are anathema, he cannot be part of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, this all hinges on, do anathemas apply to Protestants today? Anathemas, let's say, given way back in the past, right? And, the Catholic brothers have said, no, the anathemas of Nicaea II don't apply to your friendly Baptist pastor down the street or in California. And I mean, I think there's good reasons for saying that, and there's a lot that I can say, but really remember, an anathema is a legal term. It's under canon law, it has legal implications. For example, take an illegal, let's say an illegal action, right? And people who commit illegal actions are convicts. They're convicted of a crime, right? They commit a crime. If someone, let's say, goes on an illegal website and watches a movie, that doesn't mean they're automatically a convict, because technically let's say that they just go on with their day. They're never arrested or prosecuted. They might have committed a crime. You can maybe call them a criminal in a loose sense, but they're not a convict, right? And when you have an anathema, and then you say someone is anathema or falls under that anathema, that has to be judged formally by the church. And so I definitely do treat anathemas as a legal kind of term. Which is why then the church said, I think around Vatican II, if I'm not mistaken, that it's not going to use that language anymore. It's not going to apply it in that way. But I mean, people still, but don't be not mistaken. Vatican II and the church does excommunicate people still. It just doesn't use, let's say you are anathema, that language anymore. So Anselm Institute says, we must understand Nicaea II on its own terms. He says, right, that requires a lot of work that Gavin has not done, but that you are doing here. Thank you. I mean, I want to be nice to Gavin because it's a lot of work, right? And, I don't want to, I do think that Gavin, there's more work to be done, and that can be all done in a conversation and going forward, right? But I do appreciate the kind comment. I want us to be kind, though, to Gavin. And then he says here, I hope some of your graduate work further develops the work you've done here. Very grateful. Yeah, I appreciate that because, as time has passed, I've been trying to become more sharp in my research and scholarship. And even Gavin corrected me one time because he, basically, I had used a later source and it sounded like I was saying that ancient Jews believed what that source contained. It was with like Rabbi Shabbatai Bass. And he pointed out that was sloppy work. And I'm like, hey, you know what, Gavin, you're right. And so even Gavin has helped me become better. And I'm hoping that in this conversation, I can, pay that favor back to him in a way, right? That we can both sharpen each other, that we can both be like friends, like iron sharpening iron. But yeah, with my graduate work, I'm hoping that as I'm trained, that's going to help me just become more precise, better, and sharper, right? Because I really care about producing good work. And there are people who have critiqued me who have actually made very valid points. I mean, Samuel Watkinson, for example, pointed out one time that I was making too quick of a move with Ignatius of Antioch because Ignatius of Antioch mentions that the apostles are the Sanhedrin of God. And the Greek there is synedrion, which could just mean council. That's how Bart Ehrman translates that portion. And so I acknowledge now that, Samuel made a good point there. Even though Samuel is a critic of mine, and that's okay because, he made a valid point. I want to acknowledge that. And so then that does mean I need to go back to the drawing board on some of the arguments. But like things like the Eliakim argument, things like the basic idea that Jesus built a judicial system for the church, I already think that's okay. I think that that's still a solid argument. I think some of the details, though, I need to refine, which I hope to do with my graduate work. Cranman Photo Cinema asks, a question for clarification. If Gavin is correct that there is no development, what does this mean for your view? Okay, so if Gavin is correct that there is no development, then if that's true, then I would have to believe, based on what Nicaea II has said, that the apostles were bowing, kissing, and praying to images, that this was, let's say, for the most part, constant and consistent throughout the history of the church, that sort of thing. And so, for some people that would cause difficulty because then they would say, but there isn't evidence for that. And if there were evidence for that, we'd expect left and right people to write, oh, look, the Christians are kissing and bowing to images. And so somebody could say, well, it just seems really historically implausible at that point. But if you defend, and this is the other thing too, how do you falsify the teaching of the magisterium if you believe it's infallible, right? Because if you believe it's infallible, you can't argue against it on the grounds of evidence unless there's like evidence that somehow logically contradicts it. So one way that you could falsify the magisterium is if it contradicts itself on definitive permanent teachings. That'd be one way to undermine it. There might be other ways that one can think of, but somebody could still say, well, because it's infallible, I'm just going to trust it. It kind of reminds me of how, for example, and I don't know, some people will love this example, some people will hate it, but some young earth creationists say, I trust what the Bible says, and therefore, if the science doesn't back it up, the science is wrong. And so someone could say, well, okay, if, let's say, there's no development allowed, somebody could say, well, Nicaea II is infallible, and the historical record just simply doesn't record the things that it needs to record, but that's the problem of the historical record, right? That's not a problem with the council's teaching. I don't know. You could do something like that. At that point, then, no, yeah, there's serious questions that would need to be brought up. Okay, so let's see. Philo Kallion says, in what ways does burning incense before an icon venerate the saint represented? I understand the kissing the photograph analogy, but not the use of incense. So I would say here that the use of incense typically means, especially in the book of Psalms, I believe that my prayer shall arise like incense, that it's referring to, it's a representation of prayer, right? And so I think there that if you can pray to the saint and then you use incense as a way to manifest or express that you are praying to the saint, then that's a valid way to extend that. I think you're just using something to further illustrate that point. I mean, to maybe use an analogy, suppose that suppose that man in the diner whose wife has passed away, he sits down, has an image of her across, and let's say that he always keeps maybe, I don't know, a handkerchief of hers, and it smells like her, and it smells like the perfume that she wore. And this doesn't need to be weird. I mean, it can be, smell is also a way of reminding us of someone. And then if you smell the incense, it can also remind you of the liturgy. It can remind you of, the fact that that saint's in heaven, of the Old Testament use of incense, of the surrounding environment of, the cult of the saints. That's how incense can then have a valid use there. Let's see. And then Anselm Institute mentions God is glorified through veneration of the saints. That is the point that is missed by the first questioner, not a zero-sum game in God's receiving glory. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And this is a place where Protestants and Catholics differ, because Protestants, I think, it depends on how. Yeah, I think there are Protestants who have a notion of saint veneration. If I'm not mistaken, like Anglicans, I believe they do. Although it's a bit more constrained, right? It's not praying to the saint. I think no Protestant, from what I know, does that. But yeah, the way that Catholics venerate saints is not meant to be competitive with God, and it's not competitive with God. It's like let's say you're engaged to somebody, and you show honor to their mother, you show honor to the family, you show love to that family as a way to show your love for the one to which you're engaged. And so similarly, that doesn't detract from your love of your beloved. It just shows the love that you have for your beloved by honoring those who are, let's say, in their image, who share their image, right? Who share their family life. What must the posture of my heart be when I bow to an icon? Must I keep in mind that the saint is in heaven as I bow, or is it okay to bow to the image as such? I mean, that's an interesting question, because it strikes me as a little scrupulous. If you are actually believing somehow that the saint is in the image itself, that's a problem. But most of the time, if you just, bow, right, you're just doing that as a part of the liturgical community. Sometimes you're just, you're taking into account and bearing in mind the relevant distinctions that are there. But I mean, at some point, it's kind of just like hugging somebody. You just do it as second nature, right? And you become familiar with the doctrine, you become familiar with the proper limits in teaching, such that you're not overthinking it every time you're doing it. And then, let's see, Yajin Yuan mentions, congratulations on getting accepted in Harvard. I appreciate that. Thank you. Let me see if there are any other questions. As of now, it looks like there's nothing else that's being asked. So I might just end the stream right here. But no, I do appreciate all of you coming out and watching this short explanation. I'm hoping that this was helpful. And to keep this conversation going, I think it's going to be great if we can, solidify some things related to terminology. That's going to be good. Please be kind to Gavin. I'll say that again. And, I think what I'd like to do going forward is look at the anathemas, or the nature of anathemas, and then maybe look through, Nicaea 2 again, to just really confirm what do the pseudonymous sources say. Because, I mean, even though they're pseudonymous, they're still part of, interpreting the council. But I am confident, based on the research of the Catholic Brothers and even my readings of Nicaea 2, although I need to go back and really, pinpoint over hundreds and hundreds of pages, whether or not that specific claim that they bowed and kissed to icons was made. If not, then okay, we're good. And I don't think that claim was ever directly made, that the apostles kissed and bowed to icons and therefore we do. I mean, if it were, then I would expect it to be mentioned in the seventh session, because that seventh session happened a week later, and it was the definitive thought of the council. So I explained in the video too, the longer lecture, why that's important. But if that's it, then I'm hoping today was helpful. God bless you and have a great day.